Story 1. 6 months before leaving the military, I emailed my former algebra teacher seeking advice in pursuing a teaching career. She replied promptly with relevant information and encouraged me to contact her for further assistance. A month after my discharge, I sent her a follow-up email updating her on my progress and requesting additional advice. She proposed a meeting at a restaurant equidistant from our locations to discuss my options in more detail, and I agreed. Now this teacher, let's call her Stacy, always had an attractive figure. However, she always dressed modestly and rarely wore anything even remotely provocative to the class, probably for the best. Anyway, at the restaurant, she was a completely different Stacy. She had cut her hair short and dyed it in a fiery red. She had also lost a little weight and was dressed in a flattering way. From what I was used to, she was stunning. Immediately she began to tell me how honored she was that I had emailed her specifically. She said she had always liked me as a student but never thought I liked her as a teacher because of how I sometimes acted up in her class. Then she explained that she was going through a divorce and that my first email had come at the perfect time, when she was feeling her lowest. It had somehow inspired her to start taking care of her appearance and working out again, and she asked me what I thought of her now compared to then. Wow, I said. She smiled and asked me if I'd like to join her for a drink. I said yes, and she ordered us 3 rounds of tequila shots in quick succession. After the 3rd shot, she started getting touchy-feely, giving Jimmy a little squeeze. Then she looked at me and asked me if I knew what she was after. I told her yes, asked for the check, and we headed to the parking lot. I walked her to her car and she asked me to kiss her like I used to do with the girls back in school, so I leaned in for a tender kiss and we got a little frisky. While we were in the middle of that, she casually asked me where I'd parked and we took a stroll over to my truck. It had more room in the back seat, so we got in my truck and she went straight downtown. We got into it and I was so excited. We were about to get all the way, but before we could start, I heard a pop. Stacy started to cry while I held her hand. I looked down and saw that her thumb was bent at a strange angle. It felt so terrible. I had ruined our moment. I held her hand and apologized profusely. She told me it was okay, but I could tell she was hurt. I drove her to the emergency room where she got her thumb cast. 2 months later, after keeping in touch, Stacy told me that her work friends had been asking to meet the guy who broke her thumb. She was finally healed enough to want to see me again, so she invited me to her house. When I arrived, Stacy was waiting for me with a friend who was probably a couple of years younger than her. Stacy was 45 when her first encounter happened and not quite as attractive. I started talking to Stacy's friend while Stacy poured his drinks in the kitchen. We all chatted for a while, but eventually Stacy started getting touchy-feely. Then her friend just kissed me. We got up from the living room and went to the bedroom. I'm sure you can guess the rest. I stayed in touch with Stacy for a few years. We still had casual encounters when our schedules allowed, but I could tell that something had changed. She never brought her friend back over and she would get a little annoyed whenever I mentioned her. It was as if she was trying to keep her at bay. It's been almost 7 years now since I last saw Stacy. I just hope she's happy. Ouch. Looks like Captain America made a little thumb accident with a strong grip. Even super soldiers get too carried away sometimes. Story 2. I'll give some background on what happened to me a bit. This occurred in 1994 to 1995 and the later exchange was approximately 1997. I was the class clown in school. I didn't have any other learning disabilities or issues, but my clowning around became so disruptive that it was placed in special education classes. Mostly to keep me out of classes where I'd have a large audience of other students to entertain. I was classified as a student with a behavior disorder, or BD. I was in classes of 5 to 6 kids for about half the day and regular classes the other half. Myself and the other half dozen or so students in my class were assigned a new teacher who was in her mid-20s and this was her first full-fledged teaching gig. My grades and work were never a problem, but I was constantly taking over classes I was in by steering the lecture in other directions, making comments and jokes and otherwise commanding the attention away from teachers. Some of the comments I would make, particularly when in a class with only half a dozen students, were explicitly teasing towards the special education teacher. Everyone would laugh at my silly comments and one day I got sent to the assistant principal's office for it. She was called in and I was given the usual after-school detention. Usually, detention days were scheduled for specific days, but I had built up so much detention that they asked the special education teacher I spent half the day with if she would supervise detention specifically for me on a Tuesday. She agreed for that day. During detention, she dropped a plastic cup of pens and paper clips on the floor and bent over to pick it up. As she was getting up, I commented on her bending and dropping the cup again. To my surprise, she did just that so I could get a good look. At that point, the comments continued throughout the rest of the detention. From there, things escalated quickly. During that detention incident, it became clear that despite being engaged in a relationship, she was desperate for attention. If given privacy and the right opportunity, she was willing to give a boy what he wanted to boost her ego and feel wanted. I think, quite frankly, she was less than 8 years out of high school and probably had some repressed desire to be involved with a bad boy. Even though I was still way younger, there was a draw there. So what happened next? Well, as I spent more time with her one-on-one, she gradually became more open to trying new things. It was a slow burn, but after a few months, I convinced her to loosen up a bit. But then I was feeling pretty confident. Things started to get hot and heavy. We both enjoyed ourselves without having to say a word. It happened a bunch of times, and at one point, she even offered to do it as a reward. Disguised as staying late for extra credit to help me improve my grade in another class. Once I graduated, I saw her again a year or two later, giving a tour of my high school special education room to a new class of students. We greeted each other warmly and exchanged pleasantries, but I never saw her again. I've tried searching for her online on Google, Facebook, and MySpace, but I haven't been successful. Story 3. I was a freshman in college and had a major crush from a history professor. It was younger than the other teachers and knew he was attractive. It was charming and flirting enough in his lectures to keep the female students interested, but not inappropriate. This made him extremely popular with the women. And I was a naive girl who thought his vague flirting meant we were soulmates, so I pursued him. I would go to his office between classes and try to casually bump into him. I then purposely started doing poorly so that I could ask for extra help from him. I would wear low-cut shirts and try to innocently brush up against him during our sessions. This pathetic game of cat and mouse went on for about 3 months. Finally, one afternoon before a long weekend, I decided to make my move. He was in the middle of drafting an outline for an essay. He wanted me to write, so I leaned over and kissed him. He started to get up from his seat, but I threw myself at him and kissed him again. It was a quick and awkward kiss, but it led to us having a fast one on his desk. I felt so strange after. It wasn't at all how I'd imagined it would be. I started quickly packing up my books, and he didn't say a word. He just stood looking at the window silently. I tried to say something, but then I noticed a picture on his bookshelf. It was a picture of him and a pregnant woman in an embrace in front of some landmark. I turned and ran out of his office. I couldn't bear to see him again after that, so I dropped his class. I don't know what happened to him. I still feel awful about it to this day. Girls shot, but dang, it'd go down in history. She'd thrills often lead to hangovers, so maybe some fantasies are better off his dreams. Story 4. My high school teacher was always kind to me, even more so than to my classmates. She was also incredibly attractive, a real knockout. She was often physically affectionate with me, and sometimes after school, she would ask me to help her carry things to her car and reward me with a kiss and a cheek. Then she'd share her extra human biology wisdom with me. At times, she'd sport beach attire around. Eventually, I had enough and made my move. We enjoyed each other's company after class ended. For months, we continued to have fun together before or after class, and one day my classmate walked in on us in the middle of our extracurricular activities and muttered, "Bro, what are you doing with mom?" Dinner time was probably awkward for them that night. Story 5. I was in college, and she was a teaching assistant for my comparative literature class. I could tell she was into me, because she'd always gush over my essays and papers, and she was always looking at me and smiling. One day, I found a note in my dorm room mailbox inviting me to a reading of her work. I figured she'd invited everyone in the class, but when I showed up, I was the only student there. Just a bunch of other authors whose work was being read aloud. It was weird. She came and sat next to me. When we listened to the other authors read, when it was her turn, she read some of her own work. It was pretty good, and I went on like she was the second coming of Bukowski. After the reading, she asked if I wanted to go back to her place so she could read me more of her stuff. That's when I knew it was on. As soon as we got to her place, we started getting intimate. Like before we even sat down. I don't remember anything being sad before or during. It was fine. Pretty standard intimate stuff, but it definitely ended awkwardly. Neither of us really knew what to say. She eventually let me know that it was probably a good idea if we didn't tell anyone. I thought she was cool and had no intention of getting her in trouble, so I kept my mouth shut. I didn't tell my friends about it until a few years later. That's really all there is to tell. I saw her in class, of course, but it was back to business as usual. I never slept together again and she never read me any more of her work, which was fine with me. Yo, that's what I call professionalism. Props to this guy for keeping it cool. Hey guys, if you're looking for some steamy stories to spice up your school life, then give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Story 6. I had 2 relationships with school personnel when I was in high school. The first one was with my freshman French teacher. She was fresh out of college and really cool. We had an open lunch period and I would always go home for it. She was splitting her time between 2 schools and she would leave for the other school when I had my lunch period. One day she saw me walking home and offered me a ride. She started giving me rides home for lunch every day and we got to know each other well. The last day she gave me a ride, the principal drove past her parked car outside of my house while we were kissing. After that, she never offered me a ride again. I never asked her why. I started the year with a poor grade in her class, but I ended up with an A. She left the school at the end of the year and I never saw her again. Rumors were that she went back for a master's degree. I never told anyone about her relationship. The next year, I had a relationship with her school cook. She was 27 and had 2 kids. She was a friend of my older brother's friend. We used to all hang out together. After my oldest brother passed away, she and I got closer. She'd also lost her brother and we helped each other through the grieving process. We obviously got closer and got intimate a few times. One day my brother found me driving around town with her. He frantically stopped me and warned me that her boyfriend was looking to rough me up. She and I drove to a remote location and started fooling around, but I got too paranoid every time I heard a car coming, so we left. I guess the threat of being in timeout was enough. We eventually grew apart and that was that. Really, the only people who knew about her relationship were my brother and her friend. It was a small town, so I'm sure there were rumors, but I never really told anyone. Nobody got in trouble. No big dramatic ending. Story 7 for me, she was a crush. I was in my first year of post-grad and she was in her first year of teaching, so we were actually pretty close in each. All the other students in the class hated her. Except for me. I got that she was being really dry with her humor and had dug it. 2 weeks before the semester ended, I was on the forum on the class website. If someone happened to be online when you were, you could actually IM privately with them. I saw that she was online and sent her a couple of questions about the final paper. The conversation didn't stop there, though. It got fairly chatty over maybe 30 minutes or so. I asked her to add me to another chat client and over the next day or two, the conversation got progressively more flirtatious. Awesome. So at the time, she was maybe 27 or so. Her parents were both from Italy and she had that olive skin complexion that people loved so much. As a runner, her legs were shapely and led to a surprisingly fine bottom. I say surprisingly. I was less surprised when I eventually went to Italy and found that shape was pretty common. Anyway, she had a very full chest and she was quite pretty. So she had a case of RBF, which doesn't bother me at all. We decided to meet for a drink. She didn't want me to know where she lived, so she picked me up. Over drinks, I got bold and said something like, "Are you nervous knowing that I'm going to make a move on you later?" She was feisty and her wit was much sharper than mine. "Are you sure you won't cry when I reject you?" She said it so deadpan without a smile. Then she moved on to a new topic. She was impossible to read in person. At the end of the night, we were sitting in her SUV and it made my move. She flat out denied me. "You're a student. This is my career. Nobody finds out. Got it?" And so it began. The encounter was rushed. I got really handsy and she unbuckled my belt. I broke the embrace and said, "Come on, inside." "No way, you have roommates." "My place," she said. "We're in her place to dump worse than mine." We immediately head to the bedroom and it flopped down on the bed. She changed into her leopard print thirst traps. I was fascinated. She became very assertive as a cat and initiated the rodeo. I returned the favor with enthusiasm. She whispered something exciting in my ear, her voice breathy. I knew then that it wouldn't be long. Now without passionate the night has been. I've been feeling it all evening. I then warned her, prompting her to stop and help me out until it was over. Surprisingly, she gave me a B+ in the class. It was the only grade I had below an A. It nearly cost me the award for graduating top of my class, which I had pretty much secured until then. She said she was worried that people would get suspicious if she graded me higher. There was no awkwardness after. We were basically friends with benefits for a few years whenever we were in the same town together and we'd meet up. So yeah, Prof and I had a thing. She gave me my lowest mark in postgrad and it almost cost me a prestigious award. That prof was a real dynamite. I didn't know what went wrong. Was it something about his moves or his final paper? Story 8. I was a senior in high school and I messed around with my Spanish teacher a couple of times. We were always flirting and talked about different things outside of school. When I would ask him to help me with a problem, he would be a little touchy-feely. I would often hang back after class to talk to him more. Finally, graduation was coming up. It was my last day of class and I longed for him. It was quite exciting for me. After class, I went up to his desk, cleaned in, and took a bite of my Tootsie Pop. Just like in that class commercial, he then asked me if we could meet up after graduation. I said I would love to. A few days after graduation, I was over at his house having some of the best intimate moments ever. We did it throughout the rest of the summer and then I left the state. I saw him one more time after that, but it wasn't the same. Not as taboo as before. Story 9. I had a secret relationship with my teacher in high school. It might have been the worst decision of my life. In movies and TV shows, it always seems cool and exciting, but in reality, it's not worth the heartbreaking consequences. I would often go to her house. One night she messaged me online and told me that she had feelings for me. I was young and naive, so I pursued the relationship. After a while, the school, my parents, and her family found out about the relationship. It ruined my senior year of high school and burdened me for a long time. So yeah, I messed around with my teacher and the consequences were severe. Story 10. I got hot and heavy with one of my professors when I was in grad school. I was a little older than the other students and the teacher was actually younger than me. I was an English major and she was one of my writing teachers. She really liked my writing and I think that was the kicker. But what started was that she lived in New York City and so did I. She used to catch buses and trains to get back to the city after class. I actually saw her walking down to the bus stop and asked if she wanted to ride. She reluctantly said yes and I started giving her a ride back to New York City after classes because it really wasn't out of my way. She was really cool and we got along well. I asked her if she would like to come listen to some music one night after class and she obliged. My buddies and I played jazz with a little spoken word and poetry mixed in, basically got really buzzed that evening and went back to her place. She was an adjunct, so after the semester was over she moved on. We actually talked and hung out a few more times, but it wasn't serious. Heck, she's even my Facebook friend now. Years later, this guy's a modern-day Casanova. The jazz chops are John Coltrane. Story 11. I had a professor in college who I had a major crush on. The tension in class was palpable whenever we answered a question and we had to talk for a second. Everyone could tell we were attracted to each other. I had to go to his office a few times for meetings, nothing out of the ordinary, but he was just so handsome. And he taught art history, which is a fascinating subject to art historians and probably no one else. One day during one of these meetings it just happened. We kissed. It was only once, but it was amazing. We still wink at each other and stuff when we see each other, but that's it. I did get a good letter of recommendation from him though, so that's a plus. Story 12. Let me ask my girlfriend. She told me she saw a cute guy teaching a class, then one day in another class she invited her and another teacher for a drink. They ended up at a party for preschool teachers and he got her number. They went on a coffee date and drinks and then started dating shortly after that, even though she saw a class with him occasionally. I guess some students got them holding hands after class, but nobody said or did anything. From what I can gather, he was her first love. They then lived happily ever after, moving from country to country every few years in an attempt to travel the world. Yes, I was the teacher. She was 22 and I was 21. She's sitting next to me drawing something right now. I think it's Arya Stark. By the way, I'm now 27 and she's 28. I saw what he did there, looking like someone followed Arya Stark's iconic advice in Game of Thrones. Stick them with a pointy end. Hey, if you got a kick out of these stories about students getting busy with their teachers, then you need to check out students who had a sexual relationship with the teacher. How did it turn out? Story 5 is bonkers. Don't miss it.